Hello, I'm Professor Krista Petley and I work here in the Department of History at the University of Southampton. I'm joined today by my friend and colleague Dr. Chris Pryor, and Chris is an expert in African history, particularly sub-Saharan Africa in the 20th century. Chris has worked on all sorts of aspects of African history during that time period. He's worked on the colonial state in the period before the Second World War. He's currently working on Africa in the Cold War and on British policy towards its African colonies during the 1960s. And Chris also runs a very exciting module here at Southampton on the life and times and contexts of Nelson Mandela. So Chris, welcome.
Hello, welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. And what I'd like to do to start with is to ask you about all of those interests that you've got in Britain and its relationship with Africa in the 20th century. What draws you to that as a subject, and what do you personally find most exciting about it?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Start with one of the big ones. So I think so much of historical research to do with imperialism and empire over the last 20 or 30 years has been preoccupied with the question of how empire shaped Britain, how ideas about identity, about race, about Britain's place in the world were shaped by Britain's relationship with its colonies in the 19th and 20th centuries. But the thing that really interested me was that how those ideas were then subsequently re-exported out to places like Africa, how the ideas that people who were educated, brought up in Britain in the 19th and 20th centuries, how those ideas were then applied out in the colonies. So how did somebody's sense of their imperial identity, sense of race, inform the way then that Africa and other parts of the world were colonised, were governed as part of the British Empire? So I think the thing that really interests me is the intellectual, the socio-cultural, political connections between Britain and the different parts of the empire in the 19th and 20th centuries.
That's great, and it's something I think we're going to talk about today, because the main purpose for us being here is that we're going to talk about a question that's relevant to the A-level syllabus.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about a question which is, was the Second World War the most significant factor in causing the end of the British Empire in Africa? Something that you're well equipped to talk about that might relate to the things you've already started to talk about. So Chris, faced with that question about the impact of the Second World War on African decolonization, how would you start to answer that?
Sure. Yeah. Again, a great question. I think the things that I would, as somebody who teaches a lot on this and marks a lot of essays on questions like this, the kinds of things that I would be looking for in an answer to this question would be, first and foremost, a willingness to be comparative. I would want to see an answer where students were looking outside just a consideration of the Second World War. I think if you're looking at how far the Second World War was important in causing the end of empire, you can't really do that satisfactorily unless you show a willingness to engage with other topics, with other possible reasons why the empire fell. So I would perhaps look at different ways by which we could measure impact and what causes the fall of empire. So we could look at, we can look at the Second World War because we as historians are commonly obsessed with turning points and how far certain events are deemed pivotal. But can we look at other events, and can we look at longer term processes as well, which may not necessarily have been caused by the Second World War, but possibly were accelerated by it? So I'd be interested in students looking beyond simply the Second World War in an answer that, on the face of it, is just asking about the Second World War. So be prepared to be a bit more comparative, but also, can we provide more than simply a list of different factors? I think it would be very easy to come up with a list, and some of the factors that we'll talk about today, a list of the different factors, but what I'd be really interested in is it possible to put these into a hierarchy? So you don't simply have as I say, a list, but you're prepared to stick your neck out and say, look, I think this factor is particularly important. These other factors are significant, but let's relegate them. Let's say they're of secondary importance in comparison to the main event. So I think that would be another thing that I'd be looking for in an answer.
So, thank you. So important then to think beyond just the Second World War. After all, the question's asking us, was it the most significant factor? There are other factors for us to think about.
Yes.
And which of these do we think is the more important, or how do we prioritise them? If we start with the Second World War, though, how is that a factor? How does that impact on Africa and British ideas about whether or not it should continue its empire in Africa, and indeed the way that Africans try to break free of empire?
Yeah, that your last point is particularly important, because if we're considering the issue of impact can be defined in lots of ways, and impact can be measured in lots of different contexts. You could talk about the Second World War having some sort of demonstrable impact upon Britain and the way that Britain goes about governing, goes about trying to rule colonies, or you could talk about impact in the way that war shapes African societies and perhaps generates responses within African societies that lead to empire being challenged. So if we talk firstly about the impact of the Second World War upon Britain, well, you could construct a strong case that the Second World War really weakened Britain. You think about the impact that the Second World War had on Britain's wealth and Britain's financial standing. A quarter of Britain's national wealth was lost as a result of the Second World War. And Britain became the world's biggest debtor, which led to the famed economist, famed British government advisor John Maynard Keynes in 1946 famously saying, "We cannot police half the world at our own expense when we have already gone into pawn on the other half." So this idea that we've reached economic exhaustion point, and that it's not we owe so much, we've got the debtors knocking at the door, it's simply not possible for us to maintain an empire, go on as business as usual as it was before 1939.
So Britain's broke, and it owes its creditors, America basically,
Correct.
a lot of money.
Correct.
And it's struggling to afford to pay for its empire.
Yeah. Exactly. So there's that. We could also talk about the potential social impact of the Second World War, because, of course, there is a big change afoot in the domestic sphere, in that Churchill, the great wartime leader, gets booted out unceremoniously at the general election in 1945, and a new Labour government comes in, which you could argue leads to a change of tone. And the historian and Labour MP John Strachey argued that after the Second World War, Britain became more liberal. Empire became seen as outdated. There was a change in the mood. Empire wasn't seen as essential to Britain's identity, Britain's place in the world, as it had been during the high era of imperialism, very late 19th, very early 20th century. So you could say perhaps there was a different tone to British political life as well after the Second World War.
So building the welfare state at home, Britain looking inwards, how can it rebuild a society that's been shattered by war? And perhaps these great, confident, outward-looking ideas about ruling the world are less important than constructing a home fit for heroes back in Britain.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah. So that's one way by which we could assess impact. Then the second is to look actually out in Africa itself, and you could say, well, what does Africa face as a result of the Second World War? The British colonies in sub-Saharan Africa face economic difficulties. They face shortages. Of course, many men are pushed into service as part of the Allied war effort, which leads to experiences that a lot of Africans haven't really had before. African troops have served as part of British Allied forces during the First World War, but in the Second World War they're sent far further afield. So you have African troops are sent, for example, as part of the King's African Rifles, serving in the jungles of Southeast Asia, for example. And you've got some memoirs of some of those African servicemen who served in places like Burma in the early 1940s, talking about how their eyes were opened to these experiences. They all of a sudden, the vista has expanded, and they've experienced things that they've never thought of before. And for example, when they've been stationed in India, they have met Indians who are engaged in nationalist struggle against Britain. This, of course, is the era, the Quit India movement of 1942. Gandhi, Nehru, very prominent and very forceful in asserting Indian nationalist claims that would then lead to India's independence only 5 years later, 1947. So we could also talk about the fact that the Second World War really creates a certain type of migration. There's a certain, albeit temporary, population transfer. A large number of people going outside of their comfort zone, soaking in new experiences that perhaps affected them and their political outlook.
Yeah. And it's a war against racism on one level, at least, isn't it? It's a war against fascism. It's a war against Hitler and his ideology, which is very much, obviously, a racist ideology. And Britain's main ally, America, with whom they agree the Atlantic Charter, is itself a post-colonial nation that's broken away from an empire and that ideologically wants to see decolonization. So do those factors also, do you think, fit into this story of African decolonization?
Yes, and I think it's really important that you highlighted the Atlantic Charter, because the Atlantic Charter that was agreed with between Roosevelt and Churchill as a blueprint for what the post-world order might look like once the Nazis had been defeated was very explicit as to the right of all peoples to self-determination. Now, Churchill later tried to wiggle out of that and later tried to say that this only applied to the peoples of Eastern Europe who were subjected to Nazi oppression. But the genie was out of the bottle. It was already too late. And it was actually quite an important propaganda rallying point that African nationalists used. The African nationalists would commonly use British claims against Britain. So they would say, well, you have ostensibly fought this war, as you say, as a non-racial war, as a war to end racial oppression, but as a war to further the rights of people to determine their own political futures. So if we're involved in that, why are you denying us what we have gone into war to defend? So it becomes a real means by which a British political hypocrisy can be critiqued.
So this is a conflict then that has all sorts of ramifications then for Britain and its empire. Britain beginning to think differently about itself and its relationship with the world and its colonies. The political implications of fighting this particular kind of war, because it encourages nationalism in the ways you've described, because the ideology of fighting fascism feeds into this anti-colonial rhetoric as well. So the Second World War, we can see, is extremely important in framing what happens next in Africa. What else should we be thinking about as well, do you think, as this big conflict?
Great, yeah. So I think there's also ways in which the idea that the Second World War had an impact can be nuanced. The way in which we could look at the Second World War differently. Because we could also make an argument that, okay, Britain starts talking about independence in Africa in a way that it never did before the Second World War. Britain starts to acknowledge that one day the colonies in Africa will become independent. But Britain still envisages that it's going to be in Africa for a long time. As late as 1959, the Colonial Secretary Alan Lennox Boyd says Britain is going to rule Kenya until 1975. That is only 4 years before Kenya actually becomes independent in 1963. He says Tanganyika, what would later become Tanzania, would become independent only in 1970, when actually it's independent 2 years later, in 1961. So the people really at the top of the political pecking order, even they don't really think until very, very late on that Britain was going to give up its parts of its empire really quickly. So what we could say is, okay, empire is affected by the Second World War because it makes Britain realise that, okay, one day the colonies are going to become independent. But what it doesn't do is lead Britain to scramble to get out of Africa really quickly. And indeed, you can actually say that there's an intensification of imperialism after the Second World War in Africa. There is what Anthony Lowe and John Lonsdale have called the second colonial occupation, where Africa increasingly becomes seen as an alternative to India. Okay, so India has become independent. How do we get money? How do we get profit out of the colonies? Let's invest in Africa instead. Let's put development funds into Africa. Try and get something out of Africa instead. So you could say that there's a short-term impact of the Second World War is to turn British attentions to Africa in a way that they haven't really turned before, and try and get Africa on board, try and get Africa economically significant in a way that the British are happy with, to help rectify those economic weaknesses that we've already outlined.
That's extremely interesting. And we've got then this idea amongst some British people that they will be in Africa, if not forever, at least for longer than they actually were. But the winds of change blow through this continent very, very quickly. And as you say, these former colonies begin to topple and become independent nation states with great rapidity in the period of the late 50s into the 1960s. Why?
Okay, a really good question. We're tackling all the big ones today. Well, if we're talking about other impacts of perhaps of the Second World War, we could also look at the beyond economic and social impact. We could look at political, geopolitical impact, and of course, something we've alluded to a little bit already is that after the Second World War, the post-world order looks very different. We have the rise of the United States. We have the rise of Russia. This is an increasingly multilateral world in which the United Kingdom is under increased scrutiny, and it's under increased scrutiny from the United Nations. Britain increasingly having to justify its imperial presence on a global stage. Britain increasingly feeling international pressure then to get with the times. And as you said, America and Russia both speaking very forceful anti-imperial rhetoric. America, as you say, as you sum up, a post-colonial nation, critiquing empire. The British Empire, the French Empire, other European empires are now no longer fit for purpose in the modern age. There is, again, and this is another thing, another caveat, historians love caveats, is that what we have to bear in mind though is the argument of William Roger Lewis. And William Roger Lewis argues that America didn't put as much pressure on Britain to end its empire as it might have done, because Britain sells empire to the United States as an anti-communist phenomenon. That what we as Britain are doing is keeping things stable. That what we're doing is we're the frontier of progress, and using some of those old-fashioned ideas about the civilizing mission that have been there at the heart of empire for so long. That we stand for order, and that communism stands for chaos. So Britain as the supposedly, and this is all what the kind of using the words that they're using at the time, Britain is this moderate, responsible power. It is slowly ensuring that its African colonies become politically able to stand on their own 2 feet. A lot of that maternal language is being used about Britain as the mother country, guiding these colonies towards independence. Roger Lewis is arguing, well, America's anti-communism at this time trumped its anti-imperialism, so that, as I say, America maybe doesn't put its foot down as much as it might have done had it not been principally concerned with the Cold War.
But Britain is under pressure, as you say, internationally to decolonise at a faster rate perhaps than it once envisaged. And under pressure also from within these colonies, from a generation of nationalist leaders who are ready to take over. An empire does fall fairly quickly across the African continent.
Absolutely, and that's how I think we can perhaps usefully now look at other types of impact. Okay, are there other things that explain why empire, as you say, falls so quickly? And we've got this startling statistic. Harold Macmillan becomes Prime Minister in 1957, and when he becomes Prime Minister, there are 15 British colonies in Africa. When he departs as Prime Minister in 1964, there are only 4 left. So 11 colonies have become independent in 6 and a bit years. So what is explaining this very accelerated move towards independence? Well, another obvious thing that historians have turned to is the Suez Crisis of 1956. And Britain and France going into and occupying the canal zone around the Suez Canal in 1956 as a way of trying to undermine what the Egyptian leader General Nasser is doing by asserting Egypt's claim to this very important trading link with the East. And you could say that Suez, the American response to Suez is very vehement, and America threatens to sell off its reserves that it holds on pound sterling. Had it done that, that would have collapsed the British economy. So Britain, in response to this ultimatum from the Americans, pulls back and effectively concedes. So this reveals very forcefully that Britain is now no longer able to act independently of the United States if what it does is viewed by Washington as contrary to its own interests. I don't think Suez is a turning point in terms of changing the British public mood. I think John Strachey has overemphasised the extent to which people become anti-imperial. I think empire is very enduring in post-war British society, but it does bring about a political change. And that political change is that the Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, is forced to resign as a result of Suez, and we get Harold Macmillan coming in as Prime Minister. And what is one of the first things that Harold Macmillan does when he comes in as Prime Minister? January 1957, one of the first things he does is he asks for an audit. He asks for, okay, which bits of the empire are worth holding on to, which should we get rid of? So that we're already we're seeing a kind of a new type of colonial attitude there. Okay, empire is only worth having if it's worth it. If it's too much bother, we should unsentimentally get rid of it. Macmillan installs Ian Mcleod as Colonial Secretary in October 1959, who really accelerates African constitutional moves towards independence.
Okay.
Gone.
So we've got a number of things going on here then. Coming out of the Second World War, all the factors we talked about to do with that being a really important catalyst. But much of what we've talked about are these post-Second World War events, including Suez and developments, including the impact of international opinion and American pressure, all of which brings Britain to the point under Macmillan where it's taking a long, hard look at empire and understanding also that it's under pressure from Africans themselves to leave Africa, and making this decision to decolonize fairly quickly, as you've outlined. So to sum up, what do you think, in response to this question that we've been talking about, was the Second World War the most significant factor in causing the end of Britain's empire in Africa? How do we sum that up and say very quickly what we think the most important factor or factors are here? Great
question. So I think we can say that perhaps it's possible to overstate the economic and social impact of the Second World War upon Britain's imperial commitments in Africa, but there is instead the Second World War creates indirect impact in that the Second World War changes the world in which Britain is forced to live and conduct its political business, which then puts pressure on Britain to end its empire. So if we're talking about the Second World War as creating any form of impact, then I would say that longer term political pressure, the world in which Britain is operating is changing. Britain no longer able to act independently of the United States, for example. It's that really makes Britain realise that empire is no longer possible.
Chris, thank you. That's been really interesting and a fascinating tour through ways in which we could tackle this question. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.